Today, I'm going to begin a 3-week series of sermons. Today, it's more of a conversation on the emerging church. All throughout the church, we are experiencing across the world new ways of being church, being this institution that began so long ago, this thing that we call church. This new idea has been captured by the word emerging. In part, it's those new ways that are being lived out, those new practices, those new expressions that are being honored now and lived in community in very different ways than we've ever seen before. But I wanted to begin the series this week because I thought it was important for lots of reasons to do this within the context and the framework of what intentional interim ministry is all about. What intentional interim ministry is for both you as Chalmers and Sydenham Street and where you find yourselves at this time in your lives. Excuse me. I have something that I can't get rid of here. But also where I find myself with you on this journey. But I'd like to begin by sharing with you a parable that I first heard when I sat in the sanctuary many years ago when Thomas Troger was the theme speaker for our Queen's Theological Alumni, and Thomas was giving his lectures here in this sanctuary. And so here is the parable from his book, which is entitled Preaching While the Church is Under Reconstruction. It's called A Parable. Some said there had been too much rain, and the roof, long cracked after the years of stress, gave way from water seeping in. Others said, what fell from the heavens had nothing to do with it. That the earth had shifted and the church walls had pushed out toward the city market so that the massive mosaic of the Almighty Father had fallen in and left a hole. A silhouette of the icon that used to command the whole church from high above the nave. Services now were held under the God-shaped hole. Prayers said, hymns sung, infants baptized, sermons preached, offerings made, communion celebrated, couples wed, and the dead remembered. Meanwhile, reconstruction began, but it turned out harder than planned. Some folks had taken home bits of the original mosaic as a piece of devotion or historical curiosity, and when it was discovered there was not enough left to restore the original ancient grandeur, debates erupted if they should even try to recreate what was lost. Some said they should begin and finish the project as quickly as possible because people were not coming as they used to since the icon had collapsed. Others pointed out new people were entering the church, curious about the place in a way they never were before. And these newcomers joined with those who had always been scared by the icon's fierce eyes to suggest they replace the old image with a new one. The differences about what to do broke into conflict, so that for now the construction was nearly halted, though some workers tried to assemble the roof in its bits and pieces. But without an overall plan, nothing would stay put. Even the stars surrounded the whole began to fall from the ceiling, so that another party arose, suggesting they take down the entire edifice and start all over anew. Except that the most devout could not bear to lose this or that altar where they had prayed so long and the stones were worn smooth by the knees of many generations. So for the time being, all that was done was to rope off the area beneath the God-shaped hole to make sure that no one was hit by a piece of mosaic that would fall from time to time from a cracked angel or star, and to pray that people would keep coming while the church continued to be, as the sign outside alerting those who entered said, under reconstruction. I've always loved that parable. I love Thomas Troger, even though Thomas is no longer with us. And I can tell you that I've shared this parable a number of times in other places. I think it's a parable that speaks to where the whole church in the world finds itself. We are under reconstruction. We are finding ourselves living underneath a God-shaped hole. So what is interim ministry and why? Well, first, what I want to do this morning, because I know we are few, so that's not going to be as helpful as I wanted it to be, but those who are on the transition team that are here this morning, would you please stand? So let me see, who are we missing? We're missing Ross and Donna, yeah. So I just want you to keep the image of these people in your mind as I share with you this morning. You can be seated, please. Thank you. In this interim ministry time we find ourselves in, because I'm part of the we are two downtown churches in Kingston who are struggling, like many others, all across Canada and all across the world, to begin to consider the future. What that might look like. What would the vision be for the future ministry of a United Church presence in downtown Kingston? The what and the how of ultimately how this will get lived out in a missional way is what a major piece of the interim ministry time for all of us is about. We are in a major time of transition in our lives. We are a couple of churches who are living under this God-shaped hole, and I know that some are wondering, how might this intentional interim ministry even help us out? Well, it's a process, and I'm a process person, and I know some of us don't like process, and even I get frustrated with process. Sometimes I would rather just say, let's do this, instead of all the work that it takes sometimes to get to the other side, wherever the other side leads us. It's a time out for us as we find ourselves in this place and time in our lives to make decisions in all kinds of ways. I would even suggest to you in all kinds of wonderful ways. What they will be, no one knows. There is no definitive, defined picture at the end of this right now. None of us knows. From a process point of view, my role is I've been invited to come here. I'm appointed into your midst for 2 years on a contract to facilitate processes with the help of the transition team in developing those processes so that we can work with both congregations together. You've joined together and you've been together now from a worship point of view and in some other ways for over a year. In many ways, I see it from a family systems point of view. Good old Edwin Friedman, who I learned all this stuff from. In some ways, you are like two families you've decided you're going to move in together in one house. Now, sometimes what happens when new families get together, they don't realize that, well, Eric likes to kick his shoes off in the living room. Or that all of a sudden there's 10 kids and there's not just 5 kids. And they're all trying to do different things, and the families realize, well, we never done that in this house before. And the other family says, well, that's not the way that we sit down at the table to eat supper. We do it quite differently. And so in many ways, for both of you, it's a lot like a family system because you are a family in many ways. And you're learning things about each other and discovering things about each other. And some things that surprise you and overwhelm you, other things you like, other things you don't like. But you're in a family system. And if families are going to play together and live together, even for short periods of time, you have to work at what it means to do that and how you will do that. My role, in part, is to help that process so that any other processes or any other things that we decide to do, we might find ourselves in a better space and time to be able to do those things. So we have a transition team that was nominated that represents both congregations. And we meet in a regular way for good reasons. The transition team works a lot like I do. They are the eyes and the ears of the community. They listen and they pay attention to what the pulse is that's going on. Then we have other groups in our congregations that are operating as joint groups, joint worship, joint implementation team. And they're there to make sure that communications are happening in a way and communicating about what is happening in a way in the life and work. And that team and the joint worship team, they are accountable to the councils of both congregations. They don't go off in their own directions, nor does the transition team go off in its own direction and say, well, this is what's going to happen. This will be the outcome at the end of this journey. That's not going to happen. The transition team is accountable to both councils. We bring reports. You've seen some of those. At the end of the day, both of the councils of both congregations are responsible in the end to make decisions for the life and the work of the congregation and what you will decide to be about. It's not me. It's not the transition team. It's not the other teams. It's the governing body who works with the congregations in communicating things. And ultimately, when final decisions are made, it will be the congregations that make those decisions. You are members of the congregation. When I arrived here, there was nothing predetermined in any way about what the outcome of this time was going to be. That was not the message. And if that had been the case, I would never have come here. Because that's not what interim ministry is about. But also the role of an interim minister is that an interim minister is a lot like a called minister. I'm just doing different work. Now, in this particular case, it's radically different because of the nature of your two congregations working together. This isn't like a multi-point pastoral charge. This is two downtown significant churches over their history. But my role is to preach, is to teach, is to baptize, is to bury, is to marry, is to go into people's homes and visit with them, to go into hospitals and visit with people who are sick, to go into nursing homes and visit people when I can. In other words, pastoral care happens. But I'm also aware that pastoral care is happening through both congregations by lay people who are going out there and doing some of the same thing. And that's a supportive role that lay people play in the life and the work of any ministry and in the life and the work of a congregation. Today, I've asked two people from the transition team who volunteer, if they would volunteer to say just a bit about what it means for them at this time as a layperson on a transition team in this kind of ministry. And so I'm going to invite Deborah or Rosemary, whichever of the two of you want to fight your way up to the mic and share your bit with people here today.
Hopefully, can people hear me? The choir? So, my talk may be a bit longer than Barry intended, but once you give me a pulpit, I'm going to take advantage of it. So, the first thing I wanted to do is say that this is not an official transition team report. This is me speaking as a member of the transition team. So one of the things I wanted to talk about is, why did I volunteer? So as a university student back in the 70s, I actually came to Chalmers as a student, and that was when Stan Lusick was preaching here. And at that time, if you were late, you would have a difficulty finding a place to sit. I can remember coming and squeezing into pews when I was a bit late. After university, I moved around a bit and always attended a United Church. Before coming to Kingston, I was active in my congregation in rural Nova Scotia. And it was a very difficult time. I think in 8 years that I was there, we went through 4 or 5 different ministers, including an intentional period of ministry, which was very positive for our congregation. After returning to Kingston in 2003, I transferred my membership to Sydenham Street United Church and was the chair of trustees for many years. Aware of the burden of expensive buildings and dwindling congregations, Sydenham Street has been discussing for some time the need to explore further the role of the United Church in downtown Kingston. Can we be more than our buildings? The desire to partner with other congregations was joked about as dating another congregation. We sent out letters of offer to several congregations in the area, and we were delighted when Chalmers agreed to partner with us to explore further the possibility to share worship, staffing, and mission. So the idea, from my perspective, was we were dating. I don't think we'd gotten as far in my thinking as 2 families moving together, but we were just dating, and we were to see how that relationship developed over the years. By this time, I had stepped down from chair of trustees and agreed to be a presbytery representative, and then joined the presbytery executive as a member at large. Last year, I was on a commission for another struggling congregation in the area and served as a presbytery rep for their JNAC. So when Sydenham Street and Chalmers were asked to have an intentional interim minister, it just seemed logical that I would volunteer to serve on the transition team. So even before Barry arrived, the transition team met regularly. We started in July, and at that time we were meeting every 2 weeks, even before Barry came on the scene. So we developed the guidelines for how we wanted to work. We explored that I think it's 50 or 60 pages of the document on how a transition team should work. We studied that. It didn't quite fit because it was designed for one congregation, but we looked at what was useful and how we could adapt it. Some of the early principles we established were that we wanted to clearly endorse that we were 2 separate congregations. It was not the role of the transition team to try to meld them into one. With that in mind, we established co-chairs. Chairing and writing the minutes would alternate between Mary Stewart and myself. We would make every effort and endeavor that when we communicated, it would be the same message to both congregations. We learned that Chalmers would need time to work on some issues specific to itself, and that Sydenham Street would need to give them time and space to sort out those concerns. We wanted the transition team to be present, transparent, and available, and it was decided to make decisions by consensus. In August, we communicated with Barry, sending him relevant documents and our minutes. We also communicated with the appropriate people in the congregations to facilitate Barry and Linda's move to the Kingston area. Members of our team were available to give him a tour of both churches and introduce Barry to staff and congregants. We discussed ways to make him welcome and worked with members of both congregations to find ample opportunities for him to meet with members of both congregations. September, we spent time trying to get to know Barry and for him to get to know the transition team. We wanted to be a presence for the congregations, and so started the post-service transition team tables, where each Sunday 2 members would be present and write down feedback and comments. The transition team was involved in the covenanting service, which was held here in Chambers Sanctuary. The co-chairs started to report to the governing bodies of each church. We also started to attend the circles of companionship in order to facilitate a sharing of thoughts and feelings in response to the question, how are you feeling about joint ministry? The responses to the question and the feedback from the post-service tables have been collated, and there are about 40 pages now of responses which Ian and Monica have divided into 17 different themes. The transition team has met to discuss how to report on these issues. I need to tell you that it's been very difficult for the transition team to review the information we have gathered. Several members of the transition team commented that they were having difficulty coping with the level of negativity being expressed in the small groups and at the post-service transition table. Some expressed how difficult it is to listen when some of the comments reflect a misunderstanding or incorrect information. It's hard not to respond sometimes without appearing defensive. And the analogy I'm going to use here is it's if you're on a date and someone thinking they're making a constructive criticism says, well, you could lose 10 pounds. And, do you experience that as a constructive criticism or as an insult? And that's the kind of conversations that we're having difficulty with. Sometimes the comments reflect competitiveness. My sanctuary is better than yours. Whether it's parking, washrooms, elevator, coziness, there's that sort of comparing of the two sanctuaries, even though there has been no discussion at this time that we are considering changing or eliminating one building. The fact that we're going back and forth, I don't know, it seems to engender that kind of competitiveness and comparing and contrasting. So given the level of hurt feelings, angry thoughts, and the frustration experienced by the members of the transition team, some of the comments in the draft report, there was a discussion about the wisdom of putting any specific comments in the report. The principle of transparency suggests that if somebody would like to see the comments, they could request to see them. Some committees, congregations might like to see the ones specific to their areas of concern. There could be some value in reflecting upon the nature of the comments. However, some are inaccurate, reflect thoughts and feelings from several months ago, which may no longer be held. Some focus on small details and may be experienced by others as critical and hurtful. The authors of some of the comments can be identified, and other comments discuss staff issues which really should be dealt with by the joint ministry and personnel or the respective personnel committees. So how can we handle the information is going to be critical. Given that the transition team is likely a microcosm of our 2 congregations and our discussions mirror the potential response of the larger community, there is more for the transition team to do to distill the report. We have a lot of work to do before we can figure out how to reflect it back. My personal experience on this team has been positive. Barry's enthusiastic leadership is ever present, and I've come to know my fellow transition team members better. I'm reminded that despite our lively discussions, we are all kindred spirits. I do have some regrets, however. I'm delighted that Donna Delier has joined us. Her forthrightness is going to be refreshing, but I'm sad that Rosemary Robinson resigned from the team. We are now missing a strong champion for Affirm, and we will all need to be mindful about that as we continue to worship together. How do we ensure our sanctuaries are seen as welcoming and inclusive for all? I miss the discussions around social justice. That was one of my interests and one of the reasons I value the United Church. And I've been kind of sidetracked at this point and haven't been able to spend time doing the things that I really find valuable. I personally am sad that we have backed down from some planned joint ventures, such as the operations manager position. There continues to be some misunderstandings about the nature of the Spire and its role as a spiritual center for the community, as it offers uplifting concerts and provides venues for not-for-profit organizations. So instead of the thoughts of financial doom and gloom, we could, with creative, out-of-the-box thinking, possibly maintain both sanctuaries. I mean, that's still a possibility that we need to embrace. So, Barry, perhaps I've taken more time than you intended, but I wanted everyone to know that the transition team has been active and engaged in listening. It's time, however, to explore whether Sydenham Street United Church and Chalmers United Church will move beyond the perfunctory coffee date each Sunday, alternating between Tim Hortons and Second Cup, and begin to envision a sustainable relationship which will provide a meaningful mission for the United Church of Canada in downtown Kingston.
Some of what I'm going to say is, of course, going to repeat some of what Deborah has said and even what Barry said, but it's from my perspective and in my words, and it's quite short. The transition team has been meeting, as Deborah said, since I got June down. I looked at my minutes, so I don't know whether we actually had a meeting in June, but anyway, certainly July, and comprises 8 people, 4 from each congregation, as you know. And of course, our designated interim minister, Reverend Barry King. I joined the team full of hope for an exciting future of cooperation with our 2 congregations. The job of the transition team is to work with the 2 congregations and our designated interim minister to find our way forward to future United Church ministry in downtown Kingston. There is no specific agenda, but we are setting goals as we go. The first of which was to take time to find out how we are feeling about joint ministry, as Deborah has said. This has been done extensively and has generated a large body of information and a report which will be available to all. It is proving a challenge much greater than I had imagined. I would hope to see in the future the growth of cooperation between the congregations as we get to know each other and respect each other's views. Each congregation has people with diverse talents and interests who can enrich our experience in worship, mission, and friendship, to name a few. So, being on the transition team is a bit like working on a quilt. This is just a small one. There are lots of pieces to put together, even in a small one. There are different sizes, different shapes, different colors, all to be put together to produce something good, we hope. But it takes time, it takes tenacity, and sometimes difficult maneuvering around corners and getting points together. Even tedious when you're sewing all around the edge by hand. But in the end, the results can be worth all the work. And we hope for the future that that's what we have here at Sydenham Street and Chalmers, that the work will be worth it. Thank you. Thanks, Deborah.
Thank you, Deborah and Rosemary. Being visionaries in the church with a God-shaped hole begins always with the invocation of the wind and the cloud and of song and of prayer, with the poets who can help us tend to how the Spirit is coming through this God-shaped hole. The Spirit who, as Paul says, prays with us in sighs too deep for words. Or as a Roman Catholic sister said upon first considering the God-shaped hole, We do nothing immediately. We sit under the God-shaped hole and wait. I know personally that church boards would not be thrilled with that. Do nothing? Sit under the hole and wait? Disciples, Jesus, are you going to bring the kingdom now? You have to wait for the Spirit to come? I suspect if they had been typical Protestants, those disciples, they would have said, we have to organize a committee and let's get this thing on the road. We don't have time to wait around for a Spirit to tell us what to do. The early church, bereft of Jesus' presence and disappointed in its hope of its imminent establishment of the reign of God, might have seen a few people withdraw with anxiety and panic. But if you read in Scripture, there is evidence to suggest that some believers did in fact do just that. They withdrew in anxiety and panic. But others were bolder, sharing oral traditions, writing gospels and letters, preaching unrecorded sermons, living the love of Christ. And they were attentive to the humming of the soul, those early believers, and they became vessels of the Spirit. They were visionary, and long after they died, the faith that they had planted was to grow and spread in ways they had never foresaw. And quite frankly, I think that will be the case for all of us here too. We must not give in to what is popular, especially if it is repressive and if it is some misplaced nostalgia. It is our turn to carry on that great tradition of the gospel and be visionary.